Distinguished guests, dear media friends, good afternoon. My name is Luo Yan, the Media and Public Relations Director of CCG. It's a great honor for me to welcome you to CCG Luncheon Roundtable events. The event is honored to have Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, as a special guest to attend this meeting. Next is the welcome remarks session. Let's warmly welcome Dr. Miao Lu, the Secretary General of CCG.
Dear Mr. Martin Wolf, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to CCG on behalf of the Center for China and Globalization. We warmly welcome Mr. Martin Wolf to join us, and we welcome all of our friends to join us today for our CCG Luncheon Roundtable with Mr. Martin Wolf, Financial Times Chief Economics Commentator, outlook on the global economy in the era of renminbi integration. To grasp the main trends of global economic development and understand the key features of the current global economy, CCG today hosts a theme luncheon roundtable discussion on creating a new starting point for 2024 outlook on a global economy in an era of continued integration. The event is honored to have Mr. Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, as a special guest to attend and engage in discussion later. Our event also invited prominent figures from the business community and the CCG board members to engage in a depth understanding and discussions on the topics such as the reconstruction of the world economic system and the highlights and the challenge of the global economy in 2024. In the Chinese context, today is still as part of a New Spring Festival. The day after tomorrow is a Lantern Festival. So it's a brand new year for China and for the world. So we know Mr. Martin Wolf is a well-known figure in the world, and he's very well-known people who forecast and predict the future of the world economy. So we look forward to having Mr. Martin Wolf to deliver his speech. But before that, we would like to invite Mr. Henry Huyao Wang, who is CCG's founder and president, to introduce Mr. Martin Wolf. Welcome, Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Dr. Miao, for welcoming Martin Wolf, long-expected financial thinker, actually, in the world, to come to CCG. So really, it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Martin Wolf. Actually, Martin Wolf, needs no introduction. He's so well-known internationally, and I'm sure we all read his frequent comments and op-eds at Financial Times. But also, Martin Wolf is also a great friend of China. Last year, you were supposed to come to CCG. Unfortunately, we have to cut short. You will have something urgent. You wasn't able to come. But we are really pleased to welcome Mr. Wolf to come to CCG this time. And I know he had a very busy schedule. He has been speaking and talking to quite a few organizations in China, but this is the CCG, which is CCG is a non-government think tank, and which is ranked the top 100 think tank in the world, and we have actually engaged many dialogues in the past. That we had honor to have Mr. Martin Wolf actually talk to us in 2021 during the pandemic, and we had a 2 hours dialogue with him, and that was carried live in China, and actually had a great coverage of 500,000 people tuned in for that. And so today we are very pleased. We are already in the year of 2024. We just finished the Chinese New Year is almost finished, and of course I know people still coming back on that, but it's really a great occasion. At the beginning of the Year of a Dragon, we invited Mr. Martin Wolf come to CCG, a top leading think tank in China. And also today we had our council members, senior fellows, and of course also we have a media and we have a business representative all gathered here for this event. Let me introduce Martin Wolf briefly before he gave his opening keynote. Martin Wolf is a well-known global opinion leader, one of the world's most influential financial writers. And as we all know, he's also Associate Director and the Chief Economic Commentator at Financial Times. And he has been awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in year 2000 for services to the financial journalism, which is a great honor he has. Of course, he graduated from Oxford University and is also a visiting fellow of the Nuffield College of Oxford University and a special professor at the University of Nottingham, and was made Doctor of Science of the University of London. So Martin has many academic recognitions. Mr. Wolf is well known in the fields of finance, economic, and global affairs at large. I mean, particularly on the globalization, he's a top expert as well. He was also a senior economist with very impressive professional life. He worked as a senior economist at the World Bank between 1971 and 1981 for a decade, and joined the Financial Times in 1987, where he has been associate director since 1990 and chief economic commentator since 1996. So he has a very impressive career with the premier journal in the world. He's very influential in terms of finance and economics around the world, has been named the list of top 100 of the global thinkers by the Prospect and Foreign Policy. And he's the author of highly regarded books. He has very impressive books published over the years. For example, he's the author of a highly regarded book including Why Globalization Works. That really one of the bestseller in the past. And I had actually, I had seen his book at the UN bookstore, at the UN head office in New York. Also, another book is called Fixing Global Finance, which is also his top expertise. And his most, one of his most recent book, The Shifts and the Shocks, what we've learned and have still learned from the financial crisis. Of course, his latest book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which he published just last year, I understand that is also being translated into Chinese. It has a very good impact. So Martin Wolf is an old friend, as I said, of Chinese think tanks. I know he's an active participant in many Chinese forums. And we had the honor of a dialogue with him, which has been published into a book. And today we are very honored to invite Martin to share some of his thoughts. And of course, then we'll have a dialogue with Martin, and we'll have all the senior fellows and our council members and our media friends to have exchanges with Martin. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Martin. I know he has a very tight schedule today, and he's been to the State Council Research and Development Center, and he's going to Tsinghua University. But the think tank is a must stop, and we really appreciate you spend the time with us. Thank you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. In fact, this is the last event I'm going to do in Beijing. I've already done, in the last 3 days since I started, really on Tuesday, I think 4 two-hour lectures and discussions. Mostly at the DRC, Development Research Center of the State Council and the China Development Research Foundation, also at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and you are the cream of this. And I canceled something this evening because I felt that I needed a break. Well, I never accepted, and I couldn't get to Tsinghua. It was too complicated for a whole host of reasons. I've also met many people here. and I found it absolutely fascinating. And I feel that I've come to China at a sort of key moment in Chinese economic history. Let me just comment a little bit in introduction. Henry reminded you, I had forgotten that I was supposed to come and see you last time. I should perhaps tell you, if you don't know why I left so suddenly, because it was one of the more important moments in my life. I came here for the China Development Forum of last year. I'm not coming this year, in March of last year. And after a dinner on the first night, something happened which I will not forget as long as I live, which is I left and I looked at WhatsApp, which I'm sure it probably doesn't get here, but anyway, you know what it is. And I got a message from my oldest son, which just said, "Don't worry, Daddy, but Mummy is in hospital." And so I worried like hell, and I managed to get through to him, and it turned out she had an extreme medical emergency, had to be operated on immediately, and it was without a doubt a matter of life or death. And so I went back as quickly as I could. And the good news is, from my point of view, is the operation was successful. She survived. It's been a long convalescence because, like me, she's not very young anymore. But since this is a woman who has been my principal love for 56 years and my wife for 53, that was pretty important, even more important than staying in China. So that explains why I left so suddenly. And I think never before in my life have I had such a profound realization of what really matters. Now, I have given a lot of presentations by now and had a lot of discussions, and I really prefer the discussion, so I don't want to speak for very, very long. But I thought, since this is the center for globalization, I'll talk a little bit about what I think about globalization today. The talks I've given, by the way, were on the state of the world economy. That was an hour. The second one was China's macroeconomic position in the world economy, relating China's macroeconomic imbalances to global imbalances. And the one today was on China's relationships with the US and Europe. So I've covered a lot of ground. But let me focus on the globalization aspects of this, which is mostly what I talked about today. And I think it is also something I covered in a quite good article I wrote for the Financial Times at the beginning of this year for the special supplement we write every year for the World Economic Forum in Davos, in Switzerland. There's this thing called the World Economic Forum, which is where all the businesses interested in globalization tend to be, including quite a lot of Chinese. And this is basically what I said. So let's start with the underlying economics, the underlying drivers of the globalization process. And there are essentially three. Economic opportunities, which can be analyzed best in terms of standard economic models. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the core one, even now, would be Hexaroline, as it's called, which is about resources and costs. There are opportunities to trade which are determined by divergences in costs of producing things in different countries, which are to do, broadly speaking, with relative resource abundance and know-how. That combination of those two things. And sort of, the economic opportunities in a given period determined by the spread of know-how and resource abundance. The second factor, which is of course not independent, is the technologies that govern transport and communications. So, there were theoretically huge opportunities to trade in the early 19th century in commodities produced in land-abundant areas of the world to land-short areas of the world. But none of that was realizable until somebody invented the steamship. Okay? Transporting bulk commodities in sailing vessels wasn't very practical. I assume, though I've never really known, that one of the reasons that China so famously in the 14th century decided to stop its huge treasure fleets is they decided they just weren't very profitable, because it took a lot of money to build these things, and there wasn't much to trade which was going to be very valuable to China. And that depends a lot on technology. And the final element is policy and politics. Do countries want to engage with the rest of the world for whatever reason or not? Okay, those are the things that matter. And the fundamental point I made, I'm not going to go through, but if you look at the last 2 centuries or so, we see two things. I could go through many dimensions, but we see basically two things. The general thrust of global economic integration is upwards. In the very long term, there's a very clear arrow up over time. And one of the simplest ways of measuring this, and I have a lovely chart on this, which is the ratio of world trade to world GDP. And we happen to have data for this, not perfect, from the early 19th century. Invented some of it, but it's there. And back in 1840 or so, the ratio was 5%. And now it's about 30. So that's a pretty massive change. But it fluctuates enormously over that period. And what's that about? The economic opportunities on the whole clearly grew. I'll come to this more in detail. But politics and policy led to vast fluctuations. And the most important downward fluctuations occurred between 1914 and 1945, during which the major Western countries got engaged in 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and they were the dominant global economic forces at that time. China was largely outside the world economic system for much of that, for a whole host of reasons which I don't think I need to go through then. So the general thrust is up. And a particularly important period from this point of view, by most measures, the most dynamic period of globalization in world history, started roughly in 1980 and ended in about 2008. There was a huge upswing in trade, commerce, integration from the Second World War onwards, but most of that was among the high-income countries. What changed in 1980 was that a number of very important emerging and developing countries joined in. And of course, the most important of those by far was China. Okay? So globalization went global in a way it had never before done, far more than in the imperial period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that led to the extraordinary explosion of globalization on every dimension not just trade in goods, but trade in services, movement of people, quite interesting rise, movement of data, movement of technology, movement of capital in that period. And one of my friends, an Indian economist called Arvind Subramaniam, who you must know, described this as the era of hyperglobalization. And this occurred. Now, why did that era happen? Well, in this article I refer to, the basic argument is the three drivers I described all work together. They all work together. First of all, by 1980, which was after a period when most developing and emerging countries had closed themselves off from trade. China was largely closed. China did very little trade before 1978. I mean, really, India's trade ratio of trade to GDP was about 4%. It was just nothing, because they had consciously closed themselves off from trade. The South Americans, ditto, which used to be very open 50 years earlier, had closed themselves off from trade. The only exceptions were a few very small countries like South Korea, which was very open. And so the first thing was, as a result of that, you had huge reservoirs of abundant labor above all. A resource, the crucial resource, was abundant labor, which had not engaged in trade. They hadn't engaged in trade for a very long time, if ever. And from 1978 onwards, increasingly in 1980 onwards, this all changed. They opened up. And they joined the World Trading System. And this allowed those resources to be used. And that reflects on the policy point that I made and the resource availability. These huge gaps in labor costs presented an enormous opportunity for increased trade. And I really don't need to explain this to China, because that's a big part, not the dominant, but a big part of China's success. And of course, that opportunity went along with another aspect, which is the free movement, relatively free movement of capital and know-how, allowed all this abundant labor in China, but also in India, to a lesser degree and so forth, to be used in globalization. That's what happened. And then there was an additional thing, which was technology. By that time, advances made in shipping, the most important being the container ship, the invention of the container ship sometime before. In aviation, the invention of the large jet really in the late 60s, early 70s, and crucially the invention of the internet allowed the integration of production systems organizationally and in terms of transport to a degree never allowed before. So everything came together, resources, policy, and technology, to generate this utterly explosive growth of world trade, which we call the high era of globalization. Now, since 2008, this period of hyperglobalization, focusing on trade, has clearly ceased. But, and this is a crucial point, it doesn't mean globalization has actually decisively reversed. If you look at the data, it hasn't. And this is, I got one other big point to make before I conclude, but let me just spell that out a little. If you look at the statistics in aggregate, I'm not going to go, because there are so many components of all this, and I don't have time to go into it. But if you look at the statistics, data in aggregate, what has happened since 2008 for trade particularly is that prior to then, trade was growing about twice as fast as world GDP, roughly. And since then, trade has grown roughly in line with GDP. It is still true today that we do more trade with one another across the world, and that's true of China too. We do more trade with one another across the world than we have ever done prior to 2005 to 8. We are still very open. So people who say globalization is ended, in terms of levels, this is not true. In terms of change, it is true. So the era in which we integrate more and more is over. If you look at other areas of globalization, capital flows have clearly diminished somewhat, particularly capital flows from developed high-income countries into emerging and developing countries, and particularly, of course, vis-a-vis China. The services trade is still exploding. Data flows continue to rise far faster than world output. In data terms, we're integrating all the time, which is a very important thing. Data is flows of facts, information, and ideas. So those are flowing pretty freely, and I imagine even into China, despite the controls. So we haven't ended globalization, but we have ended hyperglobalization. So I want to discuss why that has ended and what it means for the future. That was what the end. So I think that the best way of thinking about what has happened is in terms of my three things. It's not, as far as I can see, mainly about protection. It might be in the future, but it hasn't been so far. I think there are two more important things that have been happening between 2008 and today. First, the underlying economic opportunity has diminished because, to take the most important player in all this, China, wage costs have very substantially converged. The enormous advantages of limitless free, cheap labor that China seemed to offer the world in 1980 are no longer the situation today, because China's relative prosperity and wages have exploded. And no other country comes close to being able to provide the abundance of cheap labor and efficient labor that China could. Even India is not in that class. It's not organized that way. So that opportunity is gone. Second, the unbundling of supply chains reached a natural limit. There are costs to unbundling supply chains. There are costs, transaction costs, there are oversight problems, complexity costs, and beyond a certain point, companies over 30 years have worked out how to do it. So even within Europe, if you take within Europe, which is a highly integrated cross-border system, and there's no protection, it just stopped growing, okay, because we exhausted it. And in addition, there have been no massive improvements in communications and transport costs and we'd exhausted most of the ones we had used, particularly on transport. There have been no profound transformations in transport costs really since the how far back we've gone? The last 40 years or so. Transport costs are basically, the transport technology is unchanged. Communication costs have improved, but from the point of view of business, the internet has already been doing that for 25 years. That's slightly exaggerating, but we've exhausted these opportunities. It's not easy to see in the data in aggregate ways in which protectionism made a decisive difference. The most important form of protectionism was, of course, the Trump tariffs on China, and the remarkable thing is how little effect they had. This is pretty striking. It is true, however, and that's the last comment on that we haven't liberalized anymore. And that was another way in which we exhausted past opportunities. The last big liberalization in the world system for globalization was China's entry into the WTO. And that happened 23 years ago. Nothing big has happened in that. That helped China's trade growth in the first 10 years of this century, but again, it's been exhausted. All subsequent liberalization efforts basically amount to very little. So for these reasons, I'm suggesting there are perfectly natural reasons, perfectly explicable reasons, why globalization has, as it were, slowed. The way I put it, it is resting. It is constant. Now the question that we end with is, are we now on the verge of a really significant collapse? And this comes down to the recent politics of surrounding globalization, principally in the US and to a lesser degree in Europe. And since these things have only begun to happen and their effects in gross trade are relatively limited, it's difficult to know how far they will stretch. But I will make 2-3 points about where we are on this, and then I will conclude. So, first, there is no doubt that this is one of the great ironies of my life. So I've been working on trade and development since the 1970s. I'm a very old person. And back in the 70s, I worked on this for the World Bank, and my main job was to persuade emerging and developing countries to open up and exploit globalization. And they all thought globalization was an advanced country plot to exploit them, including here, right? That was the consensus. And slowly and steadily, the arguments and the achievements of successful small economies like South Korea and Taiwan, and of course Hong Kong and Singapore, one or two others, persuaded people, maybe you can get rich this way. And my understanding, I've no experience, that even persuaded the Chinese leadership that this was perhaps, well, why can't we do this? And it even persuaded India, which is fantastically protectionist, and most in Latin American countries, and the most open Latin American country became Chile, and it was the most successful. So the whole mood in emerging and developing countries in the 80s and 90s changed. And they were so successful that they imposed massive adjustment costs which were not expected on the developed countries. So now, everything I started with is completely inverted. By and large, emerging and developing countries still think trade is a pretty good thing because it's done rather well for them. But in developed countries, notably including the US, they think it's a plot against them, even though they pushed it for half a century, and they were right. So that's the big reversal. Why have they turned against it? Well, because it imposed adjustment costs upon them, which they handled very badly, and which they blamed on foreigners, mainly particularly Chinese, but not only Chinese, and because they wouldn't be prepared to confront the domestic issues in the way their economy and politics work, which failed to ensure that the benefits of trade were widely shared. So that is, in a nutshell, the theme of my latest book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure is not going to be translated into your Chinese, because it's got democracy in the title, but you can all read it in complex Chinese, because you can guess where it is being published, and I assume you can get hold of it, but I have no idea about that. But anyway, the point is, as a result, demagogic politicians, particularly Donald Trump, have exploited the anxiety of people who feel they have suffered from globalization to be protectionist and to oppose further trade and blame everything that's gone wrong with them, above all on China. That's very clear. And it's always easier to blame foreigners than to blame oneself. Pretty standard. That's human. I assume it happens even here. But anyway, it certainly happens in America and to some degree in Europe. Lesser degree, we're happier with trade. That's the first and biggest thing. And the second thing that is really big is a different adjustment, a much more profound one, always possible, that the Americans have woken up and realized that China is a great power, which was inevitable. If China was successful economically, it would become a great power. And they find this very, very difficult to handle. And I've always accepted, great powers tend to have rivalries with one another. That's what they do in an open world system. And China, of course, now, in a way that it has never been in the past, is part of an open world system. It isn't a remote and distant, protected by its enormous sheer distance from all the other major centers of population, developed population. It is now part of an integrated world system because that's what technology has done. It's made the world very, very, very small. There's a wonderful story, I'm sorry I'm talking for much longer, but that just suddenly remind me, back in the 13th century, I think, European travelers, a few European travelers came to the courts of the Great Khan not in, well, Marco Polo is supposed to have come here, but in Central Asia. It took them 2 years to get here. 2 years. And 2 years to get back. Well, now it takes 8 hours. It's a difference, right? So we're on top of each other. And this is the first two breakdowns. Economic adjustment costs mishandled, great power relations, and into this occurs other realities, which is deep political fault lines in various parts of the world. And we're seeing two of them very visibly now associated with the collapse of empires. The Russia-Ukraine war is basically the consequence of the collapse of an empire. I know none of you will perhaps make this. The Middle East endless war are the product of the collapse successively of two empires, Turkish Empire and the British Empire. And managing regions where this external force disappears turns out very often to be very, very different. Another huge fault line, which is a result of collapse of empire, is Pakistan, India. I could go through many more. So geopolitics, geopolitical stresses, and domestic political stresses are making international relations very difficult and destroying the basis of harmonious competition. Here I will get to the very last. I won't go into Europe, we can discuss that. The US, I think, under the Biden administration, is trying very, very hard, and I give them some credit for this, even though they're breaking lots of rules, to contain the results of these domestic pressures about the plight of the middle classes and security anxieties, decline of relative power. That when Jake Sullivan says we are trying to build we have a high fence but with a small yard, I think he means it. They want, very strong, I've talked to them, I know these people, they don't want open-ended conflict with China. They want a deal which narrows things. Very uncomfortable with China, I understand that completely. But they want trade to continue, and they want to be able to do deals with China on very important joint interests like climate, which this administration believes in, and other things. So if they remain in charge, I think the picture I presented at the beginning should survive, and we could continue to have a functioning global order, though with complications, as there's these big difficulties over the chips, over semiconductors, a few other high-tech areas. There are going to be conflicts over Chinese exports of electric vehicles, for sure, how China handles its adjustment problems. It's manageable. If, however, we get a Trump administration, things could start blowing up. And we know that. He's proposing a very aggressive trade policy. And if this then gets into becoming a geopolitical conflict, even a military conflict among the superpowers, between the superpowers, the world is completely changed. So at the moment, I would say, we're not in a deglobalizing period. Globalization is still pretty powerful. There are strong stresses upon it, particularly from the high-income countries. Some of them have to do with domestic adjustment problems mishandled, some of them to do with shifts in relative power. But I think the leaders of the major Western countries in Europe and America want to contain the outcome and do not want a collapse in trade, in finance, or in international relations more broadly. But that cannot be guaranteed. There are profound risks in the system which mostly originate from the side of politics. And that's what happened in the interwar period. And that I talked for much longer than I expected to, as I usually do, for which I apologize, but that's what I have to say.
I think you had outlined well, and of course we read your latest article where you wrote for Davos, actually, which is excellent. You talk about the main theme of the world is still remains integration, and of course you have also talked about on the global economy where we should know for sure. So today you have highlighted again the importance of the world of still in integration, even though we had a lot of ups and downs. And we had a hyper globalization, have a slow globalization, but globalization continues. That's probably the message we got from you. And certainly the technology has pushed the globalization in a big speed and fast pace. But of course, one thing we probably didn't expect too much, we want to carry some dialogue with you, is that the nationalism, the protectionism, which is really, it's coming back. As you said, the champion of globalization, where the US, I mean, they led Britain with the system, whereas all this globalization 1.0 was very successful. Then, now they have, you said, they propose small yard, high fence, and of course they had the Inflation Reduction Act, they had the CHIPS Act, and then all those things. It looks like the champion of globalization now seems to be more on the nationalist mood. Of course, that rouses other national mood as well. So do you think this kind of a decoupling or de-risk even spread to European countries where EU has this policy of competition, a partnership, competition, and systematic risk? So you think this decoupling risk is going to really work? Is for the time being because of the Russian war in Ukraine, or is it going to come here to stay, or how can we overcome on that? That's probably the other thing, because China is still now China has been convinced to take the path of globalization. Now this path seems more zigzag than before. So what we should do about that? Perhaps you could give a bit of that before we get into lunch. We just have a few questions.
Is this right? Okay. I hope it's working for all of you. So that's a pretty fundamental question, and it requires about a 15-minute answer, which I will not do. So I think it's very, very important to distinguish different aspects of this de-risking, quote unquote, and related to different aspects. So first of all, companies make their own commercial decisions in light of their experiences. That must be true here. And there is no doubt, if you talk to Western businesses, that the shocks of the last 4 years, the pandemic, then the post-pandemic supply shortages, then the Ukraine war, and now the Middle East war, has made them aware of risks that they were not previously aware of. And one of the conclusions business leaders have reached is they need to hedge against those risks. This doesn't necessarily mean that, and they've also become more aware of political risks. If you were engaged to give you a very concrete, the business of importing gas from Russia and depending on it, as a business, you suddenly found yourself into crisis because of things beyond your control. So every major competent business in the West, I imagine here too, but I don't know because I don't know them, whether state-owned or private, must be saying to them, so how do I make my supply chain secure? How do I handle the risks? And one of the conclusions they've reached, which doesn't necessarily mean deglobalization at all, is they need to diversify. And that, of course, has costs. It's quite difficult to do. Some of the diversification is pretty meaningless. They talk about China plus one, but it turns out that the plus one is usually dependent on China anyway. So that doesn't help much. But there's no doubt businesses are exploring the possibilities and the costs of making their businesses more robust in what seems to be a very risk-prone, shock-prone world. And that's perfectly reasonable. That's what business should do. And of course, governments are encouraging them to do this to some degree, but I think the leading force here is business. There is a secondary element, which is unique to America, which is that, for reasons that I don't need to explore further, there is a lot of anxiety on multiple fronts about the rise of China. And businesses are politically exposed in the US if they're perceived to be very, very dependent on and close to China. So when I used to come to the China Development Forum, there were a lot more American business heads than there were when I last came. And that's because they're frightened. They're frightened. And that's not true for Europeans in the same way. It isn't true, but it's true for Americans, nor is it true, of course, for other Asians. That's about populist politics. Then there is the administration's level. The US is a security defense superpower. That's how it has been since 1941. It wasn't before, it was something else, but it has been since 1941, and you all know what happened in 1941, I assume. And they have looked around the world, and they've decided that, well, security is also geopolitics. And let me give you an example, which has nothing to do with the chips, though it's quite important, about something where the Americans think they were right and others were wrong. So back in the early 80s, this is 40 years ago, while the Cold War was still going on, the Europeans decided to open up a huge pipeline of gas to the former Soviet Union. And because it was the cheapest gas, supplied in the cheapest way, and it would, they thought, particularly the Germans thought, bind the Soviet Union to them. And the Reagan administration, I remember this very well, said, you're absolutely crazy, you're giving them a lever over you. And the Germans said, nonsense, all fine, they're friendly people, much better than they used to be. And then the Soviet Union disappeared, and the Germans looked to be completely vindicated. And the debate largely disappeared. And the Germans said, we have this very close relationship with Russia, it's mutually beneficial, we understand it's mutually beneficial, and by trading with them, and that was even more when the Soviet Union broke down and opened up, we provide our manufacturers, they provide us with energy, our businessmen go to Moscow, and we have a better relation with Russia than we've ever had before. And for the Germans, the relationship with Russia is historically of very profound significance. It goes back essentially 1,000 years to the Teutonic Knights. It's a long story. I won't go into that in any detail. So and that all looked fine, absolutely spectacular, until, well, 2 years ago. And the point is that the Americans now say, we were right, weren't we? We were right. It's very dangerous to rely on one supplier, particularly Russians, quote unquote, I won't go into that, for your energy. It's too important. It's too important. And another thing, so that's one aspect of this, and the other one, which is I think very important, is this long-standing issue in Western thinking that there are certain technologies which are absolutely fundamental to your military capacity, and if things go really seriously wrong, you might have to fight. So it will matter. And the Americans, as I said, are an all-round military power, and like most such powers in history, they fight, mostly stupidly, but that's another matter. I won't go into that. So the security issue is there, it's a reality. I can't really imagine that the people running the PLA don't think about this pretty often too. I mean, we'd be very surprised. But anyway, that is real. The question is, are these genuine, real cases, energy, which is central, absolutely core military-related technologies, which are central, your capacity to protect yourself, which is, can they be combined with vigorous open trade? And the answer is they can, provided people work really, really hard to build up mutual trust. And in this context, and I'll leave it that, I think it is impossible to exaggerate for serious Western thinkers, though, the impact of the Ukraine war. It's really important. And particularly for Europeans who really believed in this trade model for peace. They really did. Maybe very foolish, maybe very sensible, whatever. They really believed it. And they are really changing. So I agree with everything you say. A lot of what the Westerners say is pretty foolish and silly, but there are some real issues underneath this. And the question is, can we build a framework of trust and cooperation at the political level which will underpin deep economic integration? That's the issue. That's what the EU was designed to do for Europe. And in many ways, that's the challenge we now confront in the world, in this new situation, and we're going to have to work very, very hard at it on both sides.
Great, thank you, Martin, for your outline of the thinking on this issue. I just have one more question before I open to our roundtable. In your article at FT, talk about global economy. What exactly we know for now? You outlined the demographic changes, climate changes, of course, technology advancement, the spread and the communication of the global technology, and of course the growth itself, information explosion and things like that. But as we know, people talk about the risk and China and things like that. I was just coming back from Munich Security Conference, and then this year's theme, it was lose-lose. You know, if we continue that, we end up lose-lose. I mean, in reflection of China used to say win-win. So if we can achieve win-win, we end up in lose-lose. But also, I was invited also to speak at the German Parliament in November, where von der Leyen was speaking, and also I heard the CEO of Mercedes-Benz was talking. He was talking about the risk. The biggest risk is not going to China. And then, you know, the China now has the 70% of a global 5G, has the 2/3 of global speed railway, and out of the 10 largest container ports, 7 of them are in China. And then the success of Apple is because they relocate 95% of Apple produced in China, and then they shipped all they gave the contract of the chips to the Taiwanese company where President Trump complained about. But that's the synergy. So one of the factors, the globalization, the synergy, the effectiveness, where you have a 12 million single child college graduates graduate every year, abundant of talent supplies. So all of those factors, even though the cost, labor cost is rising, but the synergy, the efficiency, the upstream, downstream, whereas I think some German companies said, the reason they are in China, for example, the car industry, is because here's the state of our technology of the upstream, downstream, and R&D. If they can't have the entry to the China market, they cannot enter anywhere else. They have to be here to conquer China market in order to conquer the world market. So in that sense, with this super productivity that China is able to generate, would be one of the factors in the future. It's very difficult to decouple from China because of the risk. Because that's where the largest application of the digital apps and also the big market potential. Premier Lee said that Davos from this decade is 400 million, next decade will be 800 million. So will this be too difficult for them to neglect? And the 1.4 billion market where is efficiency, synergy, and high productivity, and David Ricardo's competitive advantage still works here. So that would be my last question. Thank you.
Well, there are clearly unambiguous gains from trade, which arise from, I haven't talked about, from many sources, including the ones you discussed, so I don't think there's any particular reason to dispute this. The opportunities, the importance of the Chinese market for producers, companies, varies across industries and across countries. If you look at, particularly, say, automobile manufacturers, and if you're German, you want to operate globally. The German market isn't big enough, so you need the European market, and they want as much as possible of the rest of the world's market. So the German companies like that have been actively engaged here from the beginning, and on the whole, they've done very well. The experience of Western companies in China has, to be honest, I've talked about, varied very much across the companies and the industries, and the experience they've had is complicated by Chinese practices, by the nature of the joint ventures they were in, what happened to their intellectual property and so forth. They're very variable, but there's no doubt a number of very, very important positive stories. There are, so that's absolutely clear. On the other hand, there are very major Western companies in the tech space, for instance, Facebook, which, as far as I can see, basically not here. And they've survived pretty well, too, because the rest of the world's market is also very, very large. So it's not easy to argue that they all have to be here, but some of them clearly benefit enormously from it. But this is not everything here. I'm just trying to explain why the difficulties arise. Trade is win-win in aggregate. It's not win-win for every country and for every group within countries at all times. And sometimes, depending on the comparative advantage of the country or the company or the groups within society, there can be a lot of losers. And losers are always more politically effective than winners. I mean, it's an old proposition. Mansur Olson, the great Mansur Olson, explained this best in his famous book, The Logic of Collective Action, written now, 60 years ago. Wonderful man, I knew him very well. Anyway, so up to now, the general view in advanced European industry has been We benefit enormously from trade with China. It provides a wonderful market and a wonderful place to invest, but it's not a competitive threat to us. Okay? And that's still the view of many industries. In the pharmaceutical industry doesn't see this as a threat. I think most of the tech industry thinks we can survive with China. That's all right. They're wonderful at some things, but as you said, the Apple relationship with China is mutually supportive. The chemical industry is not really worried about China's great market, but Chinese producers are not going to replace them. But there are some cases where civil aviation, at the moment, Airbus looks fine. Boeing is collapsing. It's going to take over the world. It's not worried about China. There are China competitor, but there are some industries that are beginning to be worried, and the most important of them is the motor vehicle industry, and not Mercedes, because Mercedes is doing something different, but more VW, which is, we're in the middle of a technological revolution. The technological revolution will change the motor vehicle industry probably forever, and China is the leader. So they're suddenly going to wake up and find the strongest single industry in Europe is dead. That won't go easily. As somebody pointed out to me yesterday, it employs 14 million people, which is a lot in Europe, and they will all have political stakes. So the answer to you is yes, in aggregate, you're right. On the whole, you're right, but there can be some very big difficulties, and the WTO even allows for this because you have safeguard clauses, and they will be used. And one just has to be aware of these realities. Something that is win-win in aggregate across everything is not necessarily win-win for everybody, and in a system in which everybody has political representation, that matters. And all of this leaves aside the possibility that people go so crazy that they elect a nincompoop like Trump, and then we are in a different world. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in Europe, a similar figure. Marine Le Pen in France, maybe, but she's not going to matter that much, I think. But of course, politics, as I said, quite apart from these rational reasons, can lead to profound disruption if people basically abandon reasonable policy making and start doing things that are really silly. And it seems to me, you know, if you look at the reform and opening up process and its success, and you contrast it with what happened in the 20 years earlier, you can see people can make mistakes.
Great. I think we had quite a bit of discussion here. Why don't we have a little lunch breaks, and then we continue a roundtable with all of our guests today. So thank you, Martin, for your excellent sharing and a lot of stimulating thought. And we broadcast this also tomorrow so that more people can hear your views as well.
I will
be delighted not to answer questions.
Martin, very delighted to see you here. We had lunches in London when we have enjoyed good food, and I and my colleague enjoy your conversation, your wisdom and insight into the world and Chinese economies. You know, I live in, actually work in the UK for almost 5 years. Right. Although we don't make frequent contacts, but remain a great fan of yours. I read almost every commentary you have on in the FT.
My God.
So I will, later on, I would like to actually have your wisdom on some of the issues I have in mind.
Thank you, Martin, for your introduction. My name is Sun, and I'm the former Director General of the European Department of Ministry of Commerce. So I have dealt with the EU and Brussels, and at that time also UK was a member of the EU for a little bit more than 12 years. So situation, I mean the bilateral trade China with EU is downwarding. And it changed quite a lot because for many years, at least in my term, something like 16 years of consecutive years, EU is a #1 trading partner. And last year is about 7% of a decrease. So it's a kind of tremendous change. I've never seen that for 30, 40 years already. So, and it's a lot to do with the bilateral, geopolitical tensions with US because EU is very much, the alliance of United States. So that makes a difference. And it seems in the short run it's difficult to change the situation because it's not only the trade, but also, as you mentioned, investment from both sides is decreasing. So that's the situation we are facing. I may have some questions later on.
So I would like to thank for the invitation to attend today's the roundtable. It's for me, I'm very pleased. I was working about 15 years in Europe, in the Eastern European countries, in the former Yugoslavia, and in the Croatia, Slovenia, and Poland. The last 10 years, I worked in Africa, in Zimbabwe and in Egypt. So,
Who did you work for?
Zimbabwe
No, but
and Egypt. I was in the
Ministry of Commerce.
yes, means Minister Counselor for the Economic Affairs. Yeah. So I'm very glad to hear today from your the keynotes, and I think we could understand quite well mutually because you come to China many times, and you said we need to build the framework of trust. I think with the experts like you, it's for us quite easy to build a mutual trust. But for someone, maybe it's difficult. I would like to maybe later on to ask you for the suggestions or the proposals. How can we build the framework of trust? This is a very important issue. Thank you.
问题可以现在问。
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wolf, for your wonderful speech this morning, just now. It's insightful, enlightening, and objective, as always. So for me, this is the first time I'm honored to have the opportunity to listen to you in person. I have read some of your articles online, and because your presentation contains so many important suggestions and common sense, so it's really difficult to dispute you. That's the reason why some of my former colleagues, Mr. Zhou Xiaoming, said he's your fan. I'm one of your fans. You have a lot of fans in China, maybe the disciples. I'm glad that, to see that development in the world. If you look at the Chinese economy, if you look at the outlook of Chinese economy for this year, I have read some of the predictions by experts. The Chinese economy will continue to grow. Although some say that this year the growth rate would be a little bit lower or higher, because last year got a 5%. This year, some say maybe 4.8%, some say 4.6%. Some even predict even lower. But given the size of the Chinese economy, it's still the second biggest economy on earth. So it is important that we see the continued growth, development, and continued engagement with the rest of the world. You mentioned some very important points in your speech by highlighting the risks of globalization. You mentioned that in some countries, the assessment, companies, business, some stakeholders feel fearful, frightened, uncomfortable about the rise of China. And so they have a second thought, they have a readjustment and consideration on how to handle the rise of China. I think that as long as China is still committed to the policy of opening up, reform, and the opportunities will still be there for the continued engagement and cooperation. Let me come back to the self-introduction part. My name is Huan Rengang. I'm a retired public servant from the Ministry of Commerce. I used to work as the Minister Counselor at the Chinese mission to the WTO. So I thank you for mentioning that the importance of China's entry into WTO to our development of trade, and that's very important. Before my retirement, I worked for several years in the Chinese embassy in Australia as a Minister Counselor for Economic Commercial Affairs. So I'm really happy and delighted to have the opportunities to listen to you. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Liu Hongchuan. I'm a lawyer focused on cross-border transactions. Cross-border commercial transactions, yes. Yeah, about 30 years ago, I worked briefly in London at a magic circle firm, Clifford Chance. At that time, they have like 1,000 lawyers. And if I go to the bathroom and go back, I couldn't find my office because it all looks like the same, they're all like the pigeonhole. At that time, we can't imagine that China could grow so fast after 30 years. But now the biggest law firm in the world is in China, over 10,000 lawyers. We just see how the China has benefited from the globalizations in the past 30 or 40 years, as you just mentioned. Yeah. My question is similar to Ambassador Han, that we don't want the game over. We want to continue this globalization process. What do you think that China should do, and also at the individual levels, each of us present could do to help the game is continuous? Thank you.
It's a great honor to meet you here. Just now you mentioned your principal love is going to have a very serious surgery, and I wish your principal love will have a speedy recovery, because because a gentleman like you, it's not an easy thing to make sure which one is the principal love. Okay, just now we all mentioned an issue that is supply chain, and we all know that Mr. Hui Yao and Mr. Miao, Dr. Miao, just returned from Munich Security Conference, and which this issue is also highly discussed. And I also worked in Ministry of Commerce of China, and now I also become a lawyer like Mr. Hongchuan. And my focus is export control and sanctions, and also anti-dumping and anti-subsidy. But due to the reason that we all know, the anti-dumping cases and anti-subsidy cases is not like the things like used to be. But now, more and more cases are focused on export control. And this all because of supply chains changed. And I think also this happened is very natural, because due to language limitations, I write a speech, but I'm not going to read it all. In the term of export control, the implication of the bill has gone far beyond the original legislative intent. From the original prevention of arms controls to commercial products aimed at individual countries.
You're referring to the U.S.?
Yeah. Yeah, but not very familiar with the words, so I have to write it down. And also about the labor rights. We all know that some countries, they are complaining about the labor declines, but at the same time, they are saying that, yeah, you couldn't ask people to work far away from their hometowns. But just because of this, it's not accused. It's not an original, it's a rational accused reason. Because if we say so, everybody who worked far away from the hometowns, we all can see that we are forced laborers. So the forced labors is a hot issue, and it should be very carefully discussed. So I think the things we are faced, we should more and more ask wish the WTO to play more roles and like used to be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think now Martin has finished the lunch. We're open for Q&A. I know there are some reporters here from Global Time or others. Maybe you raise your question. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wolf, and a journalist from Caixin Media. Thank you for excellent speech. I have 2 questions. So in the speech, you've mentioned that after 2008, we've seen less economic opportunities, like, for example, with less Chinese cheap labor force. And then also we've exhausted the other driver that you mentioned, the communication and transport. And you said that we haven't seen any great breakthrough. And last year, we've seen a lot of talks surrounding the topic AI. And so my question is that how do you see AI fit into these 3 drivers? And how do you see, like, what impact will it have on globalization in terms of trade? And then my second question is that because everyone's talking about the election in the US, and I was wondering because I want to ask you on the election in the UK that is happening this year, and we're seeing like Rishi Sunak has not been, like the opinion poll has been quite disastrous. And I want to ask you if the Labour, potentially, if they win the election this year, what it mean for the relation between the UK and China? And what are the sentiments like in the UK at the moment? Because, like, yeah. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to answer that? I think the honest answer on AI and trade is, though I've thought a bit about it and talked to about people about it, I don't know. Because it depends on 2 things, both of which are unknowable. First, how profound are the changes caused by AI going to be on economies, society and economies? And then, more specifically, from that, what will happen to trade? I can't see that, I may be wrong, but I can't see why AI, which will clearly change a lot, should have any particularly powerful effect, at least on trading goods. It might have more significant effects on trade in information, cross-border information, the quality of information, data flows and the management of those, and digitally enabled services more broadly. There, the implications might be quite profound. But I don't think, I haven't read or seen anything or talked to anybody who says they really have a clear idea what this will mean. And I think the main reason for that is we don't really know what it will mean anyway. I mean, my own view, I have a very simple view of this, but that probably reflects my age. It's an unspeakably bad idea, and it's going to ruin everything. But I cannot see any gain. No, I'm fibbing. I can see a few gains from basically convincing human beings we're no longer masters of our own intellectual fate. This is a pretty big thing. That's the real issue. Everything else is secondary. However, my friends in DeepMind, which is part of Google, which is quite a big company in this business, will tell me it can multiply massively our capacity of scientific advance. And that's quite a big deal. So I accept that. So, but this is a general purpose technology, and general purpose technologies, when they come along, cause changes which are very difficult to predict. On the election in Britain, I don't think the election in Britain will make any significant changes that I can see on policy towards China. I don't think we really have a policy towards China. Our policy towards China is determined by our relations with the US and Europe. So we're not going to have a different policy in any fundamental way from either. Real problems arise when the policies towards China of the US and Europe diverge. But at the moment, I would say they're not very divergent, except that Europeans are much weaker. Europeans are not very assertive. And since we have experts on Europe, I probably don't need to explain why, but I can give you the history of the last 200 years, and it will explain why. Europe is not the United States, but it will not diverge dramatically unless the Western Alliance collapses. And the Western Alliance is not really an alliance, of course. It's an underlying guarantee from the US. And that also addresses the question which one of you addressed, which is, are there circumstances in which Europe will significantly diverge from the United States? And the answer is very simple. Only if the United States basically abandons Europe. Which might happen now. It's possible. Then we are in a different world. Really different world. It would change the world of the last 80 years. So Britain's government, look, I'm a Democrat. I like one, and basically I'm a Democrat for a very, very simple reason, which will be very provocative, I understand, but so forget what I'm going to say. Most leaders of most countries at all times are incompetent. Just study history. I want to get rid of incompetent leaders without having to kill anybody. That's a very important objective, to my mind. And in the last 3 years, we have managed to get rid of 2 sensationally incompetent leaders without having to kill them. And that's a good thing. And they went, and nobody needs to think about them anymore. And we are about to get rid of a 3rd. And I think it is possible that the 4th, Mr. Starmer, will be less stupid than these people were. And that's progress.
We are reporters from the Global Times, and thanks for your great speech on globalization and global economy. But my question is related to Chinese economy. So as we know, China is seeking new drivers for its economic growth. As we see, the real estate and the foreign trade, as you mentioned, has played a diminishing role in the economic growth. So what do you think are the potential new drivers for China's economic growth? This is my first question. The second is that we see that the Chinese GDP is kind of slowing down and our economy is facing some challenges. So from your point of view, what are the challenges for China's economy this year, and what are your advice for Chinese policymakers? Thank you.
Well, I've had a great pleasure, apart from giving lectures on all this myself. My second lecture was all about your first question, and it was an hour long. I'm not going to give you the hour-long lecture. And the discussions I've had with Chinese economists, these are pretty good questions, I think. And I must say that I have been surprised from the discussions I've had with economists, some of whom I've known for decades, that they are quite downbeat at the moment. So let me separate the short term with the long term one. So my argument in my main lecture, which is one I've been putting forward for a very long time, is, and it's pretty standard, is China has two macroeconomic problems. If you talk about the question of how will China become a full, all-round, high-income country, which is obviously the objective. Okay? At the moment, China's GDP per head in real terms is roughly 30% of US levels, higher obviously related to, say, Japan. And one would say that when it's 60% of US levels, it's a high-income country. So that's clearly doable, but it's going to be harder than what's happened so far. The first challenge is raising underlying productivity. And there's quite a lot of evidence from the data which suggests that total factor productivity, which is a measure of the rise in output relative to the inputs, has not been growing very fast for quite a long time. Growth has been very, very dependent on enormously high investment rates. But that's been slowing too, and the main reason, I think very clearly, is that the margin returns on investment have fallen a lot. So there's a productivity problem, and I think there's an overinvestment problem, which is another way of saying, in my view, that China's national savings rate is too high to be productively absorbed in the economy at current levels of GDP. And there is no plausible investment, with one exception, which can offset that. And the last one, as I think you mentioned, that did absorb a lot of these savings was this huge real estate building boom, but that's pretty clearly coming to an end. And the great thing about real estate is you can spend so much that it absorbed a lot of the savings. Now, if you think about this combination of things, basically, very broadly, there are the following things you can do. You can find new domestic investments in very large scale, which will absorb resources, savings, and be efficient and productive. And it seems to me the most plausible large-scale investments, which are already happening, is in renewable energies of various kinds. And that's clearly part of it, though in commercial terms, it's not going to be terribly productive. It's profitable. It's defensive more than profitable. Even so, I think it's going to be virtually impossible to absorb it in renewable investment. The temptation, I think, in China is to, as far as I can see, is to increase investment in manufacturing. And the problem with that is it's going to create more excess capacity. And a lot of that excess capacity will end up in exporting, obviously, to the world. And if it goes to Europe and the US, there's going to be resistance. It'll be very fierce resistance. So I think that will turn out not to work. It will be a waste. Of course, investing in new technologies for Chinese markets is a different matter altogether, and some other developing markets, but most other developing markets aren't that big. So there's a limit there. So investment is part of the story. But the bigger part of the story is China's national savings rate, which is the highest in the history of the world for a country at this level of development and size, incomparably, is just higher than can be absorbed productively at this current rate of income. and it's going to have to fall. And the last really large way of absorbing the excess investment in real estate is sort of come to an end. Also, infrastructure, much of that's being built. That means consumption has to rise, and the drivers will be consumption. I promise you the drivers will be consumption, because that's what they've been for every country that got to the sort of level of GDP per head that China has now. And the question is only how it's done. It could be public consumption, it could be private household consumption, but if it's going to be public consumption, it means taxing, and if it's going to be private consumption, it means some combination of lower household savings and redistribution of income. And all that's going to be fantastically difficult. Right? So I think intellectually one can see what the drivers will be, but how it's going to happen, I don't know. But these are what will turn out to be the drivers. If that doesn't happen, the growth will slow further. And already growth has already slowed a lot. I tend to the view that in China, I'm afraid, controversially, the year-on-year GDP figures don't tell you very much. They don't tell you nothing, that's clear. But, and the problem is not that they're mismeasured, but that a lot of GDP is produced for non-commercial reasons. And if it's not done for non-commercial reasons, you don't know what value it has. So if you build, for instance, vast numbers of tower blocks which are not occupied, that's not productive GDP. So this is the issue. Now, on that brings to the second point about GDP this year, or the GDP prospects, I tend to the view that whatever the Chinese government says the target is what's going to happen. But the question is, what does it mean? Is this good, valuable GDP, by which I mean GDP that produces now or in future welfare for the Chinese people, or is it GDP which consists of creating stuff which will actually never be usable? And that's really difficult to tell. Obviously, a lot of it has been the latter, and there's no doubt China has got much, much better off. There's no doubt. But quite a bit of it has also been the former, and that is always a question. So and I mean, I'm not the only person who said this. The former premier said this, so this shouldn't be very controversial. But I tend to assume that I've talked to a lot of Chinese economists. Intelligent people seem to me think that underlying trend growth is now about 4%. Let's assume that's correct. I can say with absolute confidence, almost very few things you can say in development economics. You cannot invest productively 40% of GDP when your economy is growing at 4%. It just means, by definition, you're investing too much. And which is completely different when you invest 40% of GDP and your economy is growing 10%. Then you need all this stuff because you have to expand the capital stock so much to meet the future demand. But the difference between 4% and 10% is a very big deal in terms of the expansion of the market and the new opportunities. So 40% investment rates won't work, and they will have to fall. And one way or the other, they will fall.
I understand that Mr. Sun has a question just now you want to raise.
It seems to me that the geopolitical tensions has a lot to do with the trade tensions. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of pressures if, Trump is coming again, and the trade tension will be even more serious. Of course, business is business.
Stress. I'm not at all sure Trump will be the next president. Do not take that for granted.
Okay. Yeah, what I mean is that the trade tension is there, and it will be there for quite a long time, because China is more or less a rivalry for the United States, and in the long term. And it's not Russia. Russia is short-term enemy, but China is a long-term enemy. So with this in mind, and it's difficult for China, whatever you do, to create a kind of harmonious society or the world is difficult because you need two to tangle. And if the other side is not, very happy to cooperate with you in the world, and it's difficult for China to overcome this tension. And the problem is that, they have their allies, and I think President Biden is doing quite successfully in having those allies together with them. And EU is one of the examples, and they just follow the suit of the United States doing to China. And what's your idea about how could EU achieve the so-called strategic autonomy? Because they mentioned that, I think that could be good for China and for the world. And can they really achieve that? Economically, politically, and militarily? It seems quite difficult. What's your idea about that? Thank you.
I think that's a relatively simple one to answer. The EU will never achieve strategic autonomy. It can have it thrust upon it. That's a very different thing. The US can force it by abandoning it. And it is conceivable that the US will be that stupid. It would be a monstrous mistake on the part of the US. But, of course, if the US really convinces the Europeans they're on their own, then they have to exert strategic autonomy, or they find some other patron. It won't be China. So, but if the US doesn't force it upon the Europeans, they will certainly not achieve it. You've worked in Europe for many years. Well, I and my ancestors have lived there forever. And, well, at least for the last 2,000 years. So, and we've lived in many countries because I'm Jewish and my ancestors come from many different countries. So I really know Europe. And the Europeans don't want strategic autonomy. They cannot create effective political structures would allow them to agree on how to implement it. As things are, they are far happier with subcontracting strategic autonomy to the provider of their umbrella. And I don't see any sign of this changing unless you generate a crisis so monstrous that the Europeans will have to integrate politically, because that's what will be required. You cannot do it with the current EU. You would have to create something that looked much more like a state. A structure like the EU cannot have strategic autonomy. It has to become more like a country with a government. And then it would need an army, and it would need a lot of nuclear weapons, thousands of them. Our principal enemy is Russia. Russia has only one instrument, 5,000 nuclear warheads. We're nobody without that. That's why the US matters. Let's be serious about this. We can't have strategic autonomy without nuclear warheads if the US doesn't defend us. So well, maybe 500 warheads would do. Of course they could build them. But that's a different Europe. It's a different world, unimaginable. And I honestly don't think you'd like it. Because it would be German-led. And, well, Germany's record as a great power is not entirely happy. So, but once that happens, the Europe that then will withdraw emerge would be quite unpredictable. It wouldn't be today's Europe. And the other point I would make, I know a lot of Chinese people hope that Europe will somehow separate itself from America, but it won't, because it doesn't want to be a power. There's a very profound desire not to be a power, and that's partly because of the disagreements, the profound disagreements, which surely you know, the values, history, politics within Europe. And more important, the point I made already in my first lecture, Europe that matters is essentially an aggregation of failed imperial powers, which includes Germany. It didn't even get there, but my God, it tried to be an imperial power. It tried to centralize Europe. None of these countries view this experience with pleasure. They don't want to do this again. And that's what we're talking about. So, not going to happen. Europe will never be a good ally for China. It can be a good friend commercially. But in geopolitics, when it gets, the rubber hits the road, as people say, it's going to go with America, as long as America continues to be the guarantor of its security. And on the other creature, of course, the US behaves in an unpredictable, unpleasant, self-centered, irrational way. But from our point of view, it's the least bad, it's the worst hegemon, except all the others that are around. So that's why we'll stick with them.
Okay, probably we come to the end. Well, maybe I have a very quick final question. Yeah, okay.
Also with Global Times. So my question is, some viewpoints suggest that the current performance of Chinese economy is similar to that of Japan in the 1990s. So my question is, how do you view this comparison? What are the similarities and the differences between China today and Japan back then? And do you think there are any lessons that China can learn from Japan's experiences?
Yeah, that was the subject of my second lecture. And the answer is similarities and differences. The difference, which is very important, is that China is, relatively speaking, much further from high-income status than Japan was in 1990. So its growth potential is substantially greater, right? And so there's much less reason for the productivity slowdown that occurred in Japan. So in that sense, with the right policies, China should not end up like Japan. That's the difference. It's a very important difference. The right policies, it should be possible. The similarities are this. So this is my simple story of the last 30 years. So China has, like Japan, but even more so, all the East Asian countries, but Japan was the closest, very, very high savings, as I've told you. Peaked at 50% of GDP, roughly. Japan, it peaked at about 40. And this is fantastically good when you're growing at 10%, because that's the sort of investment rate you want. In fact, without an investment rate of 35 to 40% of GDP, you cannot grow at 10%. So for a fast-growing manufacturing country, reconstructing a modern economy from scratch, that savings rate is wonderful. Okay. In the case of Japan, that continued basically to the 70s, when it already became a high-income country. But it caught up with most of Europe. But it still was saving about 35% of GDP, and investment rates were falling. Natural investment rates, the investment rates that were growth promoting. And so as that happened in the 1980s, and you will now begin to see the similarities, if you look at the long period, the investment rate declined, and the current account surplus exploded. Because if you don't invest your savings at home with your investment, you invest them abroad. And investing abroad means you're running a current account surplus, by definition. And the Americans saw this current account surplus, which peaked at about 5% of GDP, and said, no, we're not going to have that. It creates problems for us. And so they told the Japanese, get rid of it. And the Japanese didn't do the sensible thing of lowering savings. They decided we're going to expand domestic investment. And what do you think they did? They cut interest rates like crazy, they expanded credit like crazy, and they had one of the biggest property booms in the history of the world, until China did. And that peaked in 1990, and with the property boom was a huge stock market boom because money was free. And that ended up with what they call the bubble economy, and that collapsed in 1990. And that's the similarity. Think of the Chinese current account surplus of 10% of GDP in 2008. This disappeared, and the savings rate didn't fall, so the offset was a massive rise in domestic investment as the growth was falling, and that was in real estate and infrastructure. So those are the similarities in macro level, except China did it on a much bigger level, bigger rate. Now, when the thing collapsed, the Japanese policymakers said, you've all been very bad people and very irresponsible, so we're not going to lower rates very much. We're not going to do any artificial stimulation. We're just going to allow the economy to adjust. And for them, what that delivered was deflation, entrenched deflationary expectations, which meant monetary policy ceased to be effective, and a huge financial crisis which chewed up the 1990s. And because they got deflation, monetary policy ceased to be effective. The deflationary process continued the whole of 2000 till actually now. Okay? And the terrible mistake was not to change their macro structure early in the 1990s. And this is not hindsight, it's what I wrote then. This is not, it was obvious. That was Mieno. Now, so my view is the lesson from this experience, you've got terrific potential. Do not allow deflation to set in. It's very important not to let, because then you've got with falling prices. If you've got expectations of falling prices, monetary policy becomes very ineffective. You then are then forced to use fiscal policies massively, which is very expensive, and start dealing with your structural problems, which are related to excess savings and consumption, because the economy structure was wonderful for the 10% growth year, and it isn't anymore, and nobody's tried to change it. Could be done. It's not difficult. It could be done. And I think the mistake that I fear here is they won't do this on a big enough scale, and 10 years from now, we will look back and we will say, actually, growth is now bound to 3% in the 30s. Deflation is entrenched, monetary policy is ineffective, and China is not taking advantage of the opportunities it has. So that seems to me the lesson from Japan. If the bubble bursts, stock markets are weak, which is happening, the real estate prices are falling, there are lots of bad debt in the system, which is getting worse. You have to clean up quickly. You have to stop the deflation quickly, and you have to get consumption up. And that can be done in many different ways. Otherwise, you could get caught in a trap. How likely is that? I don't know. It's certainly not certain, but my sense of this fairly strongly is the chances of this happening are quite significant. If that is right, today, this is why I said at the beginning, this is a privilege. Today is a moment in Chinese economic history that may be quite important for the next 10 or 20 years. The real estate solution to the problem of excess savings is no longer workable, and there isn't much else that really works when the economy is growing at 4% or 5%. You need to reduce the national savings rate. The national savings rate of 40% of GDP plus is just too much now. So, as I like to say, when you say people should consume more, I'm just saying that people should go out and enjoy their lives. What's wrong with that?
Okay, I think that I think on that note, we'll end this excellent CCG special luncheon roundtable that we are very honored that we had the keynote of Martin Wolf, the chief editor and commentator of Financial Times, who came to CCG out of his busy schedule during his visit to China. I think you have given a lot of a good analysis and a lot of great insights, and also absolutely a lot of straightforward and frank suggestions, and of course also observations, and very stimulating, very informative, and very helpful, I think, in many ways. And so really on behalf of Center for China and Globalization, and also all the people we have, experts and senior fellows at this roundtable, we want to thank Martin again, and let's give Martin a warm part of horse for his excellent presentation at the CCG. Thank you so much, Martin. We hope to see you again also.